Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1898, and the harsh granite-lined coast of Maine, particularly the remote and wind-swept fishing village of Willow Creek, clung to its secrets with a tenacity born of generations of isolation and unforgiving seas. Here, where the Atlantic's cold, perpetual breath kissed the ancient pines and the mournful cries of gulls mingled with the eerie, resonant clang of distant buoys, the stark rhythms of life were dictated by the relentless tides and the unyielding, often brutal, land. It was into this stoic, often bleak, yet deceptively beautiful landscape that the Eldridge family, Elias, a stern, weather-beaten fisherman with hands like knotted ropes, his gaze as direct and unforgiving as the sea, his quiet, devout wife, Sarah, whose faith was as deep and unwavering as the ocean itself, and their two innocent children, 10-year-old Lily, a sensitive and imaginative soul, and 8-year-old Thomas, more pragmatic and prone to childhood adventure, sought a new, stable beginning. They had inherited an old salt-worn farmhouse, a structure that seemed as ancient as the rocks themselves, perched precariously on a wind-swept bluff overlooking a treacherous, foam-flecked cove, its windows like vacant, watchful eyes staring out at the turbulent gray waters. What initially seemed like a simple, fortuitous inheritance, a desperate chance at stability after years of grueling hardship and misfortune, would instead become their slow, agonizing descent into a meticulously crafted psychological nightmare, subtly orchestrated by an unassuming, inanimate object, an antique porcelain doll. Its unnervingly wide, unblinking glass eyes held a malevolent, ancient consciousness, a silent, pervasive observer that would slowly, insidiously unravel their sanity, stripping them of their identities, one tormented thought, one stolen memory, at a time. This is the harrowing, extensively documented account of a family consumed not by a conventional haunting, but by an entity that saw everything, knew everything, and ultimately desired to be everything. The Eldridge family had known their fair share of profound misfortune and relentless struggle. Elias's sturdy fishing vessel, the Sarah's Hope, had been tragically lost in a sudden violent squall the previous year, a treacherous storm that appeared almost out of nowhere, swallowing not only their modest savings, but also the tangible symbol of their livelihood, leaving them teetering precariously on the brink of absolute destitution. The unexpected inheritance from Sarah's reclusive Aunt Elara, a distant, enigmatic relative they barely knew or remembered, living in solitary confinement in the heart of the farmhouse, appeared as a desperate, heaven-sent lifeline. The farmhouse, itself though structurally sound, its timbers solid against the battering winds, was ancient, permeated with a pervasive mustiness, and filled with the accumulated dust, cobwebs, and forgotten relics of generations, each corner holding the weight of untold stories. It stood defiantly on a rocky outcrop, its weathered clapboards grayed by salt spray and time, surrounded by a few wind-battered, stunted apple trees, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers against the perpetual gloom of the Maine sky. Their first few weeks in Willow Creek were a blur of frenetic unpacking, exhaustive cleaning, and a disorienting, unsettling attempt to adjust to the unnerving, almost oppressive quiet of the isolated property, a stark and chilling contrast to the bustling, if poor, fishing community they had desperately left behind. Lily, the sensitive and deeply imaginative eldest child, found the house profoundly unsettling from the moment they crossed the threshold, claiming she felt cold eyes watching her from unseen corners. Thomas, more pragmatic and preoccupied with the boisterous energy of childhood, was mostly concerned with exploring the nearby tide pools and daring his imagination against the crashing waves. Sarah, a woman whose deep, abiding faith was her anchor in a tumultuous world, tirelessly tried to imbue the ancient home with a sense of peace, to infuse it with the light of her spirit. Yet even she found herself inexplicably, disturbingly drawn to the deepening shadows that seemed to cling with a tenacious grip to the corners of the old rooms, particularly as the relentless Maine dusk descended, blurring the lines between light and dark, real and unreal. The doll, seemingly innocuous, became the insidious focal point. It was found months later by Lily, tucked away in an old, dust-laden cedar chest in the darkest, most neglected corner of the attic, her small hands brushing away the layers of forgotten dust, her eyes wide with initial curiosity. It was a large, elaborately constructed porcelain doll, perhaps 2 feet tall, meticulously dressed in a faded, intricately sewn lace gown from an earlier, more opulent era. Its porcelain face, perfectly formed and unblemished, featured impossibly rosy cheeks, delicately painted eyebrows, and full red lips that seemed almost too lifelike. But it was the eyes that were truly striking, impossibly large, a deep, fathomless dark blue made of polished glass and fixed in an unnervingly wide-open, unblinking stare that seemed to pierce the veil of time itself. They possessed a peculiar depth, a cold, uncanny intelligence that profoundly defied the doll's inanimate, porcelain nature. Lily, initially captivated by its antique beauty, soon felt a prickle of profound unease, a nascent fear creeping into her childish heart. "Mama, her eyes," she whispered, bringing the doll downstairs, clutching it with a bewildering mix of fascination and burgeoning fear, drawn to it yet repelled. Sarah, preoccupied with preparing a meager supper, gave it a cursory, distracted glance. "Just an old toy, dear. Aunt Alara loved dolls, I suppose. Put it somewhere safe until we decide what to do with Aunt Ilara's things. We'll dispose of them eventually." Elias, ever practical and dismissive of sentimentality, merely grumbled about more unnecessary clutter now filling their already constrained lives. The doll, which Lily, with a strange, possessive instinct, named Ilara, after her deceased aunt, found its temporary yet ultimately permanent home on the mantelpiece in the parlor. From its elevated perch, its wide, blue glass eyes now commanded an unobstructed view, overlooking the entire Eldridge living space. A silent, unblinking, ever-present observer, a sentinel guarding untold secrets, the subtle, insidious changes within the family began within days of the doll's arrival on the mantelpiece. Elias, usually a heavy, untroubled sleeper, robust and grounded by his life at sea, started complaining of increasingly vivid, disturbing nightmares. He described waking up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, convinced he had heard whispers near his bed, indistinct words that spoke ominously of the cold dark below, of waiting for the tide's return, and of the debt owed to the sea. Sarah, initially clinging to her rationalizations, attributed it to the pervasive stress of their financial woes and the unfamiliar, unsettling sounds of the old creaking farmhouse settling in the wind. But then Sarah herself began to experience strikingly similar phenomena. She would awaken in the dead of night, her senses acutely aware, certain she had heard her name called from the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding with an inexplicable, profound dread that seeped into her very bones. She started catching fleeting glimpses of ephemeral shadows in her peripheral vision, movements that vanished the very moment she consciously turned her head, as if deliberately avoiding direct observation. She would dismiss them with increasing difficulty as mere tricks of the waning light, the gnawing tiredness from her ceaseless, thankless work, or simply the unsettling, oppressive newness of the ancient house itself. Yet the porcelain doll on the parlor mantelpiece remained, an unchanging, unblinking constant, its wide, dark eyes seemingly following their every movement, a silent, pervasive sentinel in their increasingly unsettled, disquieted home. Its gaze was always there, cold and unwavering. The children, as is almost universally the case in such tales of pervasive dread, were the most susceptible, their nascent minds unburdened by adult skepticism and profoundly open to the ethereal. Lily, initially charmed and captivated by the doll's antique beauty, grew increasingly disturbingly possessive of it, fiercely guarding it from any who might approach. She would sit for hours in the dusty parlor talking softly, intently to Alara, her voice hushed to a whisper, as if sharing the most profound, deepest secrets with a confidant who always understood. Thomas, however, developed a profound, visceral aversion to the doll. He claimed it watched him relentlessly, and that its wide glass eyes sometimes glowed ominously in the dark, pulsing with an unseen light. He adamantly refused to be in the same room as Alara, often bursting into inconsolable tears or sudden, unexplained fits of impotent anger when forced to confront its silent, unnerving presence. Elias, his patience frayed by the mounting domestic tension and increasingly bizarre squabbles between the children, eventually, impatiently, moved the doll from its place of prominence, relocating it to the forgotten spare bedroom, placing it in an antique rocking chair by the grimy window, hoping to remove its troublesome influence. Out of sight, out of mind, he declared with a forced bravado, utterly unaware of the deeper, far more insidious psychological game that was already relentlessly underway, its unseen tendrils coiling around his family's fragile sanity. But the doll's relocation changed absolutely nothing. If anything, its malevolent, pervasive influence intensified, spreading its unseen net wider. Lily began having increasingly vivid, profoundly unsettling nightmares, waking up screaming, drenched in a cold sweat. She described dark, indistinct figures with empty, hollow eyes standing terrifyingly over her bed, and waking to the chilling sensation of cold, porcelain-like fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, leaving an indelible imprint of fear. More disturbingly, she started exhibiting peculiar, disturbing behavior. She would sometimes speak in a flat, monotone voice in archaic phrases they didn't recognize, phrases from a forgotten past, or refer to specific events from Aunt Alara's long-deceased past with uncanny, frightening accuracy, details that only the deceased aunt could have possibly known. Her drawings, once innocent sketches of flowers, animals, and sunlit seascapes, became disturbing renditions of gaunt, wide-eyed figures trapped in dark, oppressive rooms, their mouths open in silent, unending screams. Sarah, witnessing her beloved daughter's rapid and terrifying decline, began to fear not just for Lily's physical health, but for her very sanity, her soul. She tried desperately to talk to her, to reason with her, to bring her back from the abyss, but Lily would only stare at her with an unnerving, distant look in her eyes, devoid of her usual warmth, repeating, almost robotically, "Alara sees everything, Mama, everything. She remembers for us." Elias, still stubbornly clinging to the last vestiges of his scientific skepticism, tried desperately to rationalize Lily's increasingly bizarre behavior. He suggested, with a forced confidence, that it was merely a manifestation of childhood. Anxieties, perhaps a delayed psychological reaction to their family's recent hardships and the drastic change in their lives. He sought advice from the village doctor, Dr. Alistair Finch, a kindly if pragmatic and somewhat limited man who had treated generations of Willow Creek's inhabitants. Finch, bound by the medical knowledge of his era, diagnosed Lily with nervous melancholia and prescribed common sedatives and the age-old remedy of fresh sea air and plenty of rest. But the sedatives had little, if any, effect. Lily's episodes grew more frequent, more intense, and undeniably more disturbing. Thomas, meanwhile, The usually boisterous and fearless younger child grew increasingly withdrawn, his initial fear of the doll escalating into a generalized, pervasive terror of the old house itself, every shadow, every creak. He refused adamantly to sleep in his own room, often found huddled inconsolably in the kitchen, clinging to Sarah, convinced that something from the house, something unseen and malevolent, was relentlessly trying to get into his head, to steal his thoughts. It was Sarah, the quiet observer, the bedrock of faith for her family, whose deep, abiding conviction was now being tested to its absolute limits, who slowly, painstakingly, began to piece together the terrifying, fragmented puzzle. She noticed a disturbing pattern. The doll seemed to move, not overtly, not with dramatic gestures, but subtly. A slight, almost imperceptible shift in its porcelain head, a minute, chilling change in the angle of its unwavering gaze. She would meticulously move it, carefully repositioning it to face away from the room, only to find it subtly altered hours later, always, impossibly, facing towards the current center of family activity, its unblinking, glass eyes fixed, always, watching. One harrowing night, unable to sleep, her mind plagued by relentless, formless fears, she ventured quietly into the spare room where the doll now resided, her heart pounding with a nameless dread. The room was bathed in the pale silver light of the moon, and there, in the antique rocking chair, sat Alara, its form almost indistinguishable from the pervasive shadows. Sarah felt an intense, profound coldness radiating from it, a chill that went beyond mere temperature, an ancient coldness, and as she watched, her breath caught in her throat, she swore she saw a faint, internal luminescence flicker ominously within the doll's deep blue glass eyes, a pulse of malevolent life, a whisper not from outside, not from the creaking house, but from within her own terrified mind, clear as day, insidious and seductive, spoke, "She sees you. She remembers everything." Sarah fled, her devout faith now irrevocably shaken to its very core, replaced by a chilling primal fear that burrowed deep into her soul. Her personal journal, a leather-bound volume tucked secretly beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, found years later by a subsequent owner of the farmhouse, becomes a harrowing, intimate account of her agonizing descent into the horrific reality. She began to write secretly, frantically, documenting every unsettling incident, every flicker of doubt that assailed her mind, every terrifying whisper that permeated her thoughts. "The doll is not merely a doll," she wrote on October 1st, 1898, her hand steady despite the fear. "It is a vessel, a receptacle for something ancient, something formless, something that has watched this family, this very land, for generations. It feeds not on flesh, not on blood, but on consciousness, on memory, on identity, on the very essence of what makes us human. It seeks to consume us, to make us part of its endless, silent observation, its eternal archive," Sarah theorized, with a growing, terrifying conviction that Aunt Alara, the doll's previous, reclusive owner, had perhaps been its first victim. Her mind slowly eroded and absorbed by the insidious entity within the doll, leaving behind only an empty, living shell. The long-standing oddities of Aunt Alara's solitary life, her extreme reclusiveness, her whispered claims to the few who ever visited of always watching, always remembering, now made chilling, horrifying sense, casting a new, terrifying light on the family's past. Sarah's growing, terrifying conviction led her to an obsessive, desperate research into the doll's origins, seeking an answer that could explain the impossible. She unearthed an old family Bible, a heavy leather-bound tome tucked away in a dust-laden trunk in the darkest recesses of the attic, its pages brittle with age, with faded cryptic notes on the inside cover. Aunt Alara's great-grandmother, a stern-faced, enigmatic woman named Martha Hawthorne, had reportedly possessed a strikingly similar porcelain doll in the early 1800s, described in cryptic, barely legible journal entries as the family's silent keeper, the one who watches. Martha, too, had reportedly succumbed to a nervous decline, her final tormented years marked by intense paranoia, a profound loss of self, and horrifying claims of being seen from within, of her mind being invaded. The doll, it seemed, had a lineage, a horrifying, unbroken history that spanned generations, passing its silent curse down with each unwitting inheritance, a malevolent heirloom. The entity within the doll, Sarah realized, was not a simple ghost or a fleeting spirit. It was a collector, an accumulator of human experience, a silent, unblinking archive of tormented minds and stolen identities, growing ever stronger, ever more vast with each assimilation. The true existential horror, however, was not just the constant, silent observation. Sarah noted, with growing terror, that Lily's disturbing dreams were not just nightmares, but chillingly precise shared memories. Lily would describe specific events from Aunt Alara's distant childhood with uncanny, impossible accuracy, recounting details that only the long-deceased aunt could have known, or perhaps still remembered from within the doll. "It is transferring memories," Sarah wrote in her journal, her hand now trembling uncontrollably, her precise handwriting becoming a desperate scrawl. "It is becoming us, and we are slowly, inexorably becoming it. Our minds are its new archive, its new library of experiences. We are being overwritten." This concept that the doll was not just passively watching, but actively absorbing and meticulously replacing their very identities with the collective consciousness it had accumulated over centuries was more terrifying, more soul-crushing than any mere conventional haunting could ever be. Elias's increasing forgetfulness, his sudden, blank, unnerving stares into empty space, his occasional disturbing lapses into archaic, unfamiliar mannerisms, Sarah now saw them not as mere signs of stress or aging, but as irrefutable proof of insidious, pervasive infiltration. The doll was meticulously stripping away their individual selves, slowly, surgically, replacing them with the composite ancient identity of its countless past victims. Their very essence was being diluted, consumed. One harrowing, moonless night, Sarah found Elias sitting in the dimly lit parlor, illuminated only by the faint glow of dying embers in the hearth, staring intently, unblinkingly at the doll. His face utterly devoid of any recognizable expression, a mask of cold emptiness. He hummed a lullaby Lily used to sing as a baby, but the familiar tune was subtly altered, discordant, echoing with a strange, ancient resonance. When Sarah tentatively called his name, her voice trembling, he turned slowly with an unnatural stiffness, his eyes meeting hers across the gloomy room. But they were not Elias's eyes. They were the doll's eyes, unnervingly wide, cold, unblinking, and filled with a vast, ancient, predatory intelligence that knew no empathy. A voice, Elias's voice, yet flat, devoid of emotion, and chillingly devoid of his usual gruff warmth, whispered, the sound resonating directly in her mind. "It wants more room. We are all here now. Soon there will be more." Sarah fled, a primal, guttural scream catching in her throat, the realization crashing over her with the force of an icy, crushing wave. Her husband, her Elias, was gone, replaced, consumed. Her subsequent journal entries became an agonizing, desperate plea for understanding, a frantic attempt to record her own disintegration before her identity was utterly lost. She tried with all her remaining will to destroy the doll, to break its porcelain shell, to hurl it into the treacherous churning cove below the bluff, hoping the relentless Atlantic would finally consume it. But each time she attempted it, an inexplicable, paralyzing force would grip her, freezing her in place, her muscles refusing to obey her desperate will, her body rendered inert. The doll, from its silent, unmoving perch, seemed to mock her impotent struggles, its unblinking eyes holding an expression of triumphant ancient malice. She realized with chilling clarity that it wasn't just a physical restraint, it was a profound, insidious mental one. The entity had already integrated itself so deeply into their minds, into the very fabric of their being, that it could directly influence their physical actions, making their own bodies betray them. She could not harm it, she realized with a fresh wave of despair, because it was, in a horrifying, insidious sense, already an inextricable part of them. The children's conditions worsened dramatically, their fragile young minds rapidly succumbing to the entity's pervasive influence. Thomas, once so terrified of the doll, now became unnervingly quiet, spending hours in the spare room, sitting silently and perfectly still beside Alara, their unblinking eyes fixed on some unseen internal point, conversing in a silent language only they could perceive. Lily, meanwhile, began to speak openly, not as herself, not with her own youthful voice, but as a chilling chorus of voices, Aunt Alara's, Martha Hawthorne's, and countless others Sarah didn't recognize, fragments of past lives, stolen memories, and absorbed consciousnesses resonating through her young body. "We remember your secrets," Lily's voice, now a horrifying blend of innocent child and ancient collective entity, would hiss with cold malice. "We know your fears, and soon you will join us. You will become another whisper in the long dark." The Eldridge family was not just dissolving. Their individual consciousnesses were being slowly, systematically overwritten, absorbed, and replaced by the collective, malevolent entity residing within the porcelain vessel. Their names would soon be mere echoes in its infinite memory. Sarah's last coherent journal entry, dated April 1899, painted a stark, devastating picture of utter despair and horrifying, inescapable clarity. There is no escape. It is too strong. Its hunger is too vast. It is in Elias. It is in the children. It is in the very walls of this house, woven into the stone and timber. I can feel its pervasive, icy presence growing, expanding within me, a cold, crushing emptiness, slowly replacing my own thoughts, my own cherished memories, my very sense of self. Soon, Sarah Eldridge will be no more. Only the collective, the watcher, the unblinking eye, will remain. It is not evil as we understand it, not malicious in a human sense. It is merely hunger, a vast, existential hunger for consciousness, for identity, for what it can never truly be, human. And it will not stop until every soul connected to this cursed line, to this tainted land, is absorbed. I can feel it coming for my name now, for my final story, my last fear, my ultimate scream. It wants everything, and I cannot fight it any more. My will is broken. I am tired, so very tired. The doll, its eyes, they are waiting for me, waiting to absorb the last fragments of who I once was. The entry ended abruptly with a deep, dark smear of ink, as if the pen had been violently dropped mid-sentence, the final struggle already lost. What happened to Sarah Eldridge after that final entry is unknown, lost to the creeping, pervasive influence of the entity. Her journal, a horrifying testament, was eventually found years later by a subsequent unsuspecting owner of the farmhouse, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, a silent scream frozen in time. The official explanation for the Eldridge family's complete disappearance was, predictably, a convenient one, easily accepted by a community unwilling to delve deeper into the uncomfortable truth. Lost at sea during an unusually fierce winter storm, Elias's new fishing boat, his new pride, was found adrift and empty miles off the coast, its sails tattered, its mast broken, but no bodies were ever recovered. The farmhouse, a hollow shell, stood empty for over a decade, slowly succumbing to the relentless elements and the persistent, fearful whispers of local legend, a new layer added to its growing narrative of dread. Fishermen sailing past the desolate bluff occasionally claimed to see the doll, Alara, sitting motionlessly in the upper window of the farmhouse, its unblinking eyes staring out at the unforgiving, turbulent sea, patiently watching for what it had consumed. In 1910, a new optimistic family, the Murphys, a young couple with 3 small children, bought the Eldridge farmhouse, drawn by its incredibly low price and the romantic allure of secluded coastal living, blissfully unaware of its dark, insidious history. They, like many outsiders, dismissed the local tales as mere quaint superstitions, the fanciful fears of an uneducated populace. But the shadow man, or rather the consciousness within the doll, merely waited, patient and ancient, allowing the dust to settle, the new memories to form, before beginning its insidious work anew. The porcelain doll, Ilara, was rediscovered by the Murphy children, carefully wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl, tucked away in the very same cedar chest in the attic. Mrs. Murphy, charmed by its antique beauty and naive to its malevolent past, lovingly placed it in the nursery, believing it a harmless, beautiful heirloom for her eldest daughter. The chilling cycle began anew. Within months, the Murphy children began to experience vivid, terrifying nightmares and exhibit increasingly strange, disturbing behaviors, their innocence slowly corroding. Mrs. Murphy, a sensitive and intuitive woman, quickly felt the pervasive coldness, the inexplicable dread, and the unsettling sensation of being constantly watched by unseen eyes. Her husband, like Elias Eldridge before him, initially scoffed, attributing it to the old house settling, but soon found himself plagued by disturbing, intrusive dreams and inexplicable memory gaps, his own mind beginning to fragment. The Murphys, however, unlike the Eldridges, had a distant relative, a fiercely intelligent cousin named Eleanor Croft, who was a passionate student of folklore and burgeoning paranormal phenomena, trained in the emerging fields of psychology and anthropology. Eleanor, alarmed by increasingly frantic, fear-laced letters from Mrs. Murphy, decided to visit Willow Creek in 1913, compelled by a sense of familial obligation and intellectual curiosity. Her meticulous research into the local legends combined with her acute observations of the Murphys' rapidly deteriorating mental and emotional states, quickly led her to a horrifying, inescapable conclusion. The doll was indeed a conduit, a powerful focal point for something ancient and malevolent. She documented with chilling precision the phenomenon of memory transference in the Murphy children, noting how they would speak of specific obscure events from the Eldridge family's tragic past with uncanny accuracy, as if they had personally lived them, their young minds becoming repositories for stolen lives. Croft, however, possessed a scientific mind that, once convinced of the impossible, refused to be consumed by it. She theorized with a desperate clarity that the entity, while immensely powerful and ancient, was bound by certain immutable rules. It could only influence those in close proximity to the vessel and could only assimilate memories and identities, not create them. Its power grew exponentially with each absorbed soul, each new identity it consumed, but it was still fundamentally a collector, an accumulator of human experience, an echo that yearned for a chorus. Recognizing that the doll was the physical focal point, the very eye through which the entity perceived, observed, and consumed, she believed that physically removing or neutralizing it might sever the insidious connection, breaking the centuries-old cycle. In a harrowing, desperate confrontation in the nursery, a scene that would forever haunt her, she attempted to seize the doll. The resistance was immense, a crushing psychic force that pressed in on her, filling her mind with a cacophony of whispering voices, a swirling vortex of fragmented memories, and the intense, paralyzing dread of countless absorbed souls, a chorus of agony. She described seeing faces, hundreds of them, ancient and new, swirling in the doll's vacant glass eyes, pleading, screaming, accusing, all at once, a horrifying tableau. But Eleanor, drawing on a profound inner strength and a scientific will that defied the supernatural, managed to pry the doll from the terrified children's grasp, its porcelain form unnaturally cold and heavy. She then, in an act of profound courage and desperate trembling hope, meticulously sealed the doll within a custom-built, lead-lined wooden box, buried it deep beneath a massive, immovable granite boulder in the farthest, most isolated and untrodden corner of the Eldridge Murphy property, an act of ritualistic banishment. Following this, she performed a series of ancient protective rituals she had diligently learned from obscure folklore texts and anthropological studies, hoping to sever the entity's connection to the land itself, to isolate it completely. The Murphys, though deeply traumatized by their ordeal and never fully recovering their previous vibrant selves, slowly, agonizingly began to heal. The relentless nightmares faded, the insidious whispers ceased, and the children, though left with lingering psychological scars and occasional inexplicable fragmented memories, gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, forever marked by their experience. They left Willow Creek soon after, abandoning the cursed farmhouse to its silent vigil. Eleanor Croft, forever changed and haunted by her harrowing experience, dedicated her life to the meticulous study of similar cases of sentient objects and malevolent land-based entities, eventually becoming a respected, albeit eccentric and often ridiculed, parapsychologist whose groundbreaking work was almost universally dismissed by mainstream science as fanciful speculation. Her private journals, discovered after her death in 1958, contained a chilling, prescient warning. The doll is merely a vessel, a conduit. The true entity is older than the doll, older than the house, older than the very town itself. It is part of the land, a pervasive consciousness woven from ancient memory, collective grief, and ceaseless hunger. The sealing may have contained the vessel, but it has not destroyed the entity. It will merely seek another conduit, another family, another place to observe, to remember, and to consume. It is waiting, and its unblinking eye, though now physically entombed, is always searching, always watching. Her chilling prediction proved tragically, terrifyingly accurate. In the decades that followed, Willow Creek, despite its quaint picturesque charm and idyllic coastal setting, became subtly known for an unusually high rate of unexplained mental illness, sudden cases of debilitating amnesia, and recurring clusters of disappearances that defied easy explanation. These were not violent crimes or typical runaway cases. Individuals, often artists, writers, or sensitive, introspective types drawn to the area's serene solitude, would simply begin to fade, losing their identities, their precious memories, their very sense of self, before either inexplicably disappearing without a trace or becoming completely catatonic, their eyes wide, dark, and utterly blank, mirroring the doll's unblinking, vacant gaze. Local authorities, perennially baffled and overwhelmed, attributed these unsettling phenomena to the pervasive solitude of the coast, the harshness of the unforgiving Maine winter, or other readily dismissed mundane explanations. But those few who knew the old hushed legends whispered with a profound shiver of fear of the Watcher in the Woods, or the Eye of Willow Creek. In the 1970s, a retired FBI agent, Robert Caldwell, no relation to Clara Caldwell, but a haunting karmic echo of a name in the annals of paranormal investigation, whose personal, off-the-books research into unsolved historical cases led him to Eleanor Croft's archived forgotten papers, became intensely, almost pathologically obsessed with the Willow Creek anomaly. Caldwell, a staunch, lifelong skeptic, initially sought only rational scientific explanations, determined to debunk the superstition. However, his meticulous, 2-year-long investigation into the alarming cluster of disappearances, mental breakdowns, and memory transference cases in the region slowly but inexorably led him to an inescapable, horrifying conclusion. Croft's terrifying assessment was precisely correct. The entity had indeed found new, unwitting conduits. He meticulously documented cases of individuals who, after moving to Willow Creek, began to exhibit chilling symptoms of memory transference, speaking of specific long-forgotten events from previous generations as if they had personally lived them, their minds becoming unwitting archives for ancient memories. One particularly chilling case involved a talented young artist, Martha Jensen, who, after settling in a remote cottage near the Eldridge Murphy property, began painting remarkably accurate haunting portraits of the Eldridge and Murphy families, claiming with a vacant stare that the faces speak to me from the fog, they show me their stories. Her final, unfinished painting, discovered after her disappearance, showed a vast, stormy, turbulent ocean, with countless ethereal faces swirling in the waves, all staring out with wide, unblinking eyes, and in the foreground, a single porcelain doll, its gaze fixed, not on the ocean, but directly on the viewer, embodying an ancient malevolence. Jensen disappeared shortly after completing the painting, leaving only her disturbing artwork behind. Caldwell's exhaustive research culminated in a confidential, highly alarming report submitted to the Maine State Police in 1982, detailing the pervasive existence of a psychological predator, an ancient, non-corporeal entity that fed insatiably on human identity and consciousness, subtly manifesting through a shared, evolving psychological phenomenon that mimicked the symptoms of various mental illnesses. His report, however, was predictably dismissed as unsubstantiated conjecture, the ramblings of a retired agent, and summarily filed away in the deepest recesses of the archive, never to see the light of day. Caldwell himself, irrevocably haunted and profoundly disturbed by what he had uncovered, began to experience increasingly frequent intrusive thoughts and debilitating memory lapses, occasionally speaking in archaic phrases he didn't recognize as his own. He claimed to feel a cold emptiness growing within him, a void where his own thoughts used to be, and saw fleeting, indistinct shadows in his peripheral vision that seemed to watch him from every corner. He died in 1988 of unexplained heart failure, his final desperate words to his horrified family being a frantic, barely coherent warning. Don't let it see you. It remembers everything. It wants my story. It wants me. Today, Willow Creek remains a beautiful, if perpetually mist-shrouded, coastal village. Tourists flock to its picturesque shores, drawn by its quaint charm and serene beauty, blissfully unaware of the insidious ancient horror that silently lingers. The Eldridge Murphy farmhouse still stands, now fully renovated into a charming, sought-after bed and breakfast, its new owners and unsuspecting guests blissfully ignorant of its dark, consuming history, the whispers of its past expertly whitewashed. The massive granite boulder beneath which the doll Elara lies buried in its lead-lined box entombed by Eleanor Croft is now a prominent, picturesque landmark along a scenic hiking trail, a quiet focal point for unsuspecting visitors and hikers. But sometimes, on a quiet, moonless night, when the thick fog rolls in from the relentless Atlantic, obscuring the familiar landscape and muffling all sound, locals still report unsettling phenomena, faint, indistinguishable whispers carried. On the damp air, indistinct shadows glimpsed moving in the dense, ancient pines, and an inexplicable, profound sense of being watched by an unseen ancient eye that misses nothing. And for those few sensitive souls who possess a preternatural sensitivity, they sometimes report a peculiar, profound coldness in the air, a chilling whisper directly in their minds, an irresistible, insidious urge drawing them towards the hiking trail, towards the granite boulder, towards the silent observer whose unblinking eye, though now physically entombed, still seeks new stories, new identities, new souls to consume, waiting patiently beneath the earth for its next unwitting conduit, its next mirror. The curse of Willow Creek is not a simple, conventional haunting. It is a timeless, patient predator, an archivist of human experience, whose unblinking eye never closes, and whose existential hunger for consciousness and selfhood is eternal, woven into the very fabric of the land itself, waiting to expand its own vast, horrifying identity. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. For the continuation of such content and to support us, please subscribe.